a stone. And during this time, she was able to access entry to the school by posing as a social work graduate. So she's pretending like she ain't got no clue in the world what's right and what's not right.
Right.
So after her observation of Willowbrook, she shared her information with the press. And shortly after, a series of articles appeared in the local newspapers describing crowded, filthy living conditions in Brook, as well as the neglect and poor treatment of residents. So Jane Curtin was the first reporter to write about Willowbrook after visiting the facility in the mid-60s. The story, though, didn't gain any attention, even close to what she was hoping for, until ABC's news correspondent Geraldo Rivera did an expose titled Willowbrook, The Last Disgrace. And it was a national spotlight on Staten Island and the school's treatment of its residents. And the excerpt before it was aired was like none I've ever heard before. So before this expose aired, this was the trigger warning. Tonight, as a public service, we're going to make you sick. That says it all, huh?
Right.
And I do remember this as a child. I know you weren't even born yet.
I know.
But I remember this on TV.
I know, but at least they gave that warning. I mean, back then, we get away with so much shit now on TV. I remember the first time they said shit on ER, and I was like, what?
Well, now they have commercials with that comedian talking about tampons. I mean, and it's pretty graphic. So, I mean, basically anything goes now, but just crazy.
Right.
In his expose, he actually said, I can show you what it looks like. You can hear what it sounds like. But how can I tell you about the way it smelled?
Ooh.
It smelled of filth. It smelled of disease. It smelled of death.
Ugh. I'm sure there were probably dead bodies in there with 50 people to one nurse.
Unfathomable. As a result of the overcrowding and inhumane conditions and treatments, on March 17, 1972, a class action lawsuit was filed against the state of New York by parents of Willowbrook residents in federal court. Apparently, after Kennedy's visit in 1969, there was no follow-up as far as the 5-year action plan for improvements, like we were talking about. Why didn't they do that? Maybe then they would have prevented more misuse of those people. But in 1975, Willowbrook consent decree was signed by Judge Orrin Judd. It committed New York State to improve conditions at the school and lower the overcrowding from 4,000 patients to no more than 250 by 1980. The consent decree stated that the state would be required to spend $2 million to create 200 places for Willowbrook transferees into hostels, hotels, halfway houses, group homes, and sheltered workshops. The consent decree did not immediately close Willowbrook State School, but rather recognized that people with developmental disabilities had the constitutional right to be protected against harm and be cared for in a humane, non-institutional setting to prepare them to be contributing members of the community. In 1983, New York State announced plans to close Willowbrook, which had been renamed the Staten Island Developmental Center in 1974. By the end of March 1986, the number of residents had dwindled to approximately 250, which they wanted it lowered to 250 by 1980, didn't they?
Yes.
So they didn't make their mark again. It was mandated by the court September 17th, 1987, the last child left the grounds. According to an article in February 2020 New York Times article, the pledge to protect was broken. Many of the institution's 2,300 former residents who are living today still suffer from mistreatment. The Times obtained from interstate data that in 2019 there were 97 reported allegations of physical abuse by group home workers against Willowbrook residents, 34 allegations of psychological abuse, and hundreds more of neglect, medication error, misuse of restraints, seclusion, and theft. Investigations were conducted by the state of New York for people with developmental disabilities, but were unable to prove abuse, claiming strong union protection.
I hate that bullshit. Like, I get unions need to exist because some employers take advantage, and for reasons such as this, they need to exist. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be allowed to basically treat these people the way that they were treated, like cattle, and be protected by the union. Because that's a crime. I mean, you're neglecting them, you're abusing them. I don't care what the union says. That is against the law, and you should be held accountable.
Yep. So because they couldn't prove abuse because of the union, it allowed them to block their dismissal in arbitration. Bronx County District Attorney Darcel Clark investigated one facility that housed Willowbrook residents but found insufficient evidence of abuse, stating witnesses weren't willing to come forward and victims weren't able to speak for themselves. She went on to say, it's not whether or not it happened, it's what could we prove. So, very sad.
It is sad.
And that's what, when we were first researching this, we came across Cropsey.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought he was a patient there. But you did research proving otherwise.
Right. So Cropsey was an urban legend that was spread around the 70s and 80s in Staten Island after some local kids started to go missing, and they were later, one was found murdered, but some weren't found at all. So people started calling this boogeyman Cropsey because upstate New York, Cropsey was a popular name. So it was just kind of a common last name that they threw at this person. But for those that believed that Cropsey is an actual person, they do suspect Andre Rand, a convicted kidnapper, was the source of Cropsey in an award-winning documentary, Cropsey. Rand had worked as an orderly or a janitor, depending on which source you look at Willowbrook from 1965 to 66. At the time when he was employed, municipal employees did not have those stringent background checks. So even then in the 60s, they still weren't what they are today. But they done that, they would have learned that he was convicted and served 16 months in jail for sexually molesting a 9-year-old girl.
Well, that's nice.
Yep. So Rand was actually born Frank Rishan on March 11th, 1944. No one knows for sure when Rand changed his name from Rishand. I'm sure judging if he had some kind of speech impediment or something like that, people might have just heard it as Rand. He did have a younger sister that claimed neither of them were sexually or physically abused as kids. Their father had died when he was 14 on March 27th, 1958. And his mother was institutionalized at the Pilgrim Psychiatric Center in Brentwood, New York. The siblings would visit her, but Rand's mother had suffered and struggled with mental health and lived at the Pilgrim Street State Asylum. He had taken jobs as orderlies, which made sense because usually when there's trauma or suffering in the family members, the members tend to go into those types of jobs to be able to help. So some people said Rand claimed that he was a physical therapist. There's no evidence of this or that he had any formal training, so I don't know where that came up. But
Well,
in
by the looks
Hmm?
by the looks of him, he didn't look like he had any kind of schooling.
That's because that was another thing when they were sentencing him and everything. It was, like, can you be sentenced? So, I mean, and in the 1966, his story just took a 180. He left his job at Willowbrook, but he stayed on the grounds. He actually set up a campsite where there was actually this whole, like, vagrant community that eventually moved underground when all the other buildings started to be closed down so that they can just go from building to building. So the buildings were Willowbrook, Seaside, and the New York Colony Farm that had closed from former patients and the other homeless. So the former patients that didn't have anywhere to go just stayed, and the homeless people also moved in. So they were protected. And I mean, Staten Island's probably no fun, I would say, in the winter. So having that tunnel system probably helped them out tremendously. So some of Rand's criminal life, some of the sources I couldn't verify. In 1969, he was sentenced, which I don't think that date is correct because he had already worked at Willowbrook and he had already served some time. Another year that's unknown, Rand was arrested after he kidnapped a bus full of kids and took them from the local YMCA to the airport.
Wait, I gotta stop. Why did he do that?
I have no idea. I can just like see him pulling up, or like the kids are on the bus waiting for the bus driver and he just gets in and just like, all right, here we go.
Maybe the beach was closed.
It had to be, unless they were flying to the beach. You never know. I just thought that was craziness.
Yeah, that is craziness.
So he's also suspected in the disappearances of Alice Perrier. She was 5 at the time. Holly Ann Hughes, who was 7. Tahisa Jackson, who was 11. Hank Gafforio. I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry. That was 20. He was 22. And then Jennifer Swager. The jury could not reach a verdict on any of the murder charges because none of the bodies had ever been found. However, Rand was sentenced to 25 years for kidnapping. He was up for parole in 2008. However, new evidence was discovered in the Holly Hughes case in 2004. And then, because Rand is such a genius, one of his fellow inmates happened to take some notes from some conversations that he and Rand had in their cell, in which Rand told his fellow inmate in very descriptive detail how he abducted Hughes.
Oh, so he was like pouring his whole guts out.
Yeah, it's like, come on, you fucking idiot. Like, I'm glad criminals are dumb, though, because now he got an additional 25 years to life. He won't be eligible for parole until 2037, when he'll be 93.
Do you think that his cellmate there was an informant? Like,
oh, yeah.
On a daily? Like a total narc, telling on everybody? Or do you think it was just this one time?
I bet it was just this one time, because if he took, like, notes, you know what I mean? That's different than, like if you watch Oz or anything like that, and they'll be like, oh, so-and-so's dealing H, and that, like, they just have, like, a running list in their head. But for him to, like, write this down and have detailed information that was used against him at court,
I would have told, too.
Oh, definitely.
I'll tell on everybody. Maybe it'll get, like, a shorter sentence or something.
Right.
Oh,
especially,
wow.
But people hate people that mess with kids. in jail. That's no bueno.
Yeah,
Because
and
she
then you
was
get shivved
7.
in the shower if you tell.
Right. Well, I
Well, you
think
could
it's
get shivved in the